The morning I understood what my life had become, I was standing at a sink full of dishes watching steam rise from the water. My husband was at the kitchen table behind me. He hadn't spoken in 4 days. Not one word. Not good morning. Not pass the salt. Not even a look that acknowledged I existed in the same room he occupied. I was 22 years old. We had been married 3 years. And I remember the exact thought that moved through my mind as I watched that steam curl and disappear. I thought, this is what invisible feels like from the inside. I did not understand yet that what he was doing had a name. In my community, it wasn't called punishment. It wasn't called cruelty. It was called correction. And correction, I had been taught since before I could read, was what a faithful husband did for a wife who had not yet learned her proper place before God.
Stay with me, because what I am going to tell you about what happens inside Amish marriages when a wife steps outside the boundaries her husband has drawn is something that most people in the outside world have never heard described from the inside. And if any part of you was raised to believe that love and control were the same thing, some of what I say is going to feel uncomfortably familiar.
My name is Sarah. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I speak the truths my former community sealed behind closed doors and plain-faced silence. I grew up in a conservative old-order community in eastern Pennsylvania, and I spent 9 years inside an Amish marriage before I found my way to a different kind of life. If you want to hear more of what life behind the prayer cap actually looks like, please subscribe and hit the like button. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single message, and if you want to go deeper than what I share here, the full Amish Insider Guide is linked in the description below. Let me start with the foundation, because without understanding the foundation, nothing else makes sense. When outsiders imagine Amish life, they tend to picture simplicity, quiet fields, horse-drawn buggies, a people who have chosen to live apart from the noise and speed of the modern world. And in the most surface-level sense, that picture is not entirely wrong. But what that picture leaves out is the invisible architecture underneath the simplicity, the structure that holds every part of that world in its assigned place and leaves almost no room for anyone, especially any woman, to ask whether the assignment fits. In Amish theology, the husband is not merely the head of the household in a symbolic or conversational sense. He is the spiritual authority of that home. He answers to God through the bishop. His wife answers to God through him. That chain does not have gaps in it. There is no space between a wife's question and her husband's answer where she is permitted to form her own conclusion. The Ordnung, which is the unwritten code that governs every dimension of Amish life, does not simply suggest wifely submission, it requires it. And the community that enforces the Ordnung does not distinguish between a wife who is resistant and a wife who is suffering. Both conditions look the same from outside the front door, and both receive the same counsel. Be patient, pray harder, submit more completely. I married Eli when I was 19 years old. He was 26. Our families had known each other through the church district for my entire life. He was hard-working, respected, not a man who raised his voice at singings, or made himself conspicuous in the ways that concerned parents watch for. Our courtship lasted 8 months. At our wedding, the bishop spoke at length about the sacred architecture of a godly home, the husband as cornerstone, the wife as the hands that serve what the cornerstone supports. I listened to every word. I believed every word. I had been prepared for exactly this role since the morning I was old enough to understand what a role was. The first year held its own difficult education. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would have registered as alarm to anyone watching from outside, but a slow, consistent lesson being delivered in small installments about who held authority over what, and what happened when that authority was questioned. The first time I purchased something at market without mentioning it to Eli beforehand, he did not raise his voice. He sat across the kitchen table from me that evening and read scripture for 20 minutes while I stood. He chose passages about the foolish woman who tears down her own house with her hands. He did not say I had done something wrong, he simply read. And I understood. That understanding, I know now, was exactly what he was building. The correction that Amish husbands are permitted to administer to wives who are not obedient enough does not look the same in every home. It exists on a range, and where any particular marriage lands on that range depends on the man, his upbringing, his temperament, and crucially how much his community is watching and how much they have decided to care. What I can describe is the shape of it, the levels of it, and what it costs a woman to live inside it for years. The first and most constant form is scriptural. The husband selects verses, He deploys them at meals, at bedtime, in response to any moment where his wife has expressed a preference or an opinion or a need he has decided is excessive. The verses are almost always the same verses. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. The woman is the glory of the man. She should be silent. He does not need to shout them. He does not need to frame them as accusations. He simply reads them into the air of the room and lets the architecture of a woman's entire religious upbringing do the work of making her feel that her own thoughts are a form of sin. The second form is absence. He stops speaking to her, not out of anger that burns and fades, but out of a deliberate and sustained withdrawal that can stretch across days or weeks. He eats the food she has spent hours preparing and does not look at her. He moves through the house as though she is a piece of furniture he has stopped finding useful. For a woman whose entire identity has been constructed around the home she manages and the husband she serves, being made invisible inside that home by the very person whose recognition defines her worth is not a minor discomfort. It is a particular kind of erosion. Slow, quiet, and total. The third form is restriction. He decides she may not attend the next church service. He decides she may not visit her mother this week. He decides the buggy is not available to her. He decides her sister's letter will not be sent until he has read it. Each individual restriction sounds small when I describe it outside the context of a life lived under all of them simultaneously. But the accumulated effect of being unable to move, communicate, or connect without his explicit permission turns the home from a place of refuge into a place of confinement. The walls do not change, the windows are the same, but something in the air shifts, and eventually a woman stops looking at the windows altogether, because looking has begun to feel like its own kind of pain. The fourth form is the one that outsiders, when they hear about it, tend to react to most immediately. And I want to be precise here, because I have always tried to be honest rather than sensational on this channel. Physical correction inside Amish marriages is not universal. I will not claim that every Amish husband behaves this way, because that is not the truth, and this channel has no interest in anything that is not the truth. But it is also not rare. It is not an aberration that surprises the community when it surfaces. It is something enough Amish women carry in their bodies and their silence that the community has developed an entire architecture of response designed not to address it, but to absorb it and continue. In my own marriage, the physical dimension arrived in year 4. A disagreement about something that I could describe as trivial if I thought the word trivial had any place in this part of the story. He grabbed both my arms above the elbows and walked me backward into the pantry wall hard enough that a jar of preserved tomatoes fell from the shelf and broke on the floor. He said, "When you speak to me that way, you show me your pride." Then he left the room. I cleaned up the tomatoes. I told no one. I told no one because I did not have language for what had happened that existed outside of the framework that said a wife who provoked her husband's correction shared responsibility for what followed. I was not yet able to hear the word provoke and understand what was being done to me with it. The kindness that came afterward was genuine. That is the piece that takes the longest to explain to people who have never lived it. The kindness was not performance. Eli was not a man who manufactured tenderness strategically. He was a man who genuinely believed that what he did was correction, that correction was love, and that love looked like warmth and partnership when the household was in proper order. The weeks after a hard incident were often the most tender weeks of our marriage, and that tenderness created a kind of hope that was very difficult to release, because releasing the hope meant accepting a different story about what the marriage was, and that story required more courage than I had access to for a very long time. If you want to go deeper into what Amish women face inside these marriages, the full Amish Insider Guide is linked in the description. When a woman in my community reached a point of genuine desperation, there was one formal path available to her. She could go to the bishop. I want to describe this path honestly, because the people who designed it were not, in their own understanding, designing something cruel. They were designing something they believed was faithful. But the destination of that path was not relief. The bishop's role was not to protect the wife from the husband. The bishop's role was to restore the household to proper spiritual order, which meant restoring the wife to proper submission within it. The questions he asked were designed to locate where her resistance had introduced disorder. The counsel he offered was designed to help her become less of whatever had caused her husband to need to correct her. And the bishop's conversation with the husband, which happened either simultaneously or immediately after, did not constitute accountability. It constituted counsel between two men who shared the same understanding of what a wife was supposed to be. I know women who went to the bishop once and never went back. Not because the situation in their home resolved, but because going created consequences that exceeded what they had been living with before the visit. A husband who learns that his wife has brought her difficulties to the bishop does not always respond with the gentleness the bishop has counseled. Sometimes he responds with a demonstration that certain things in the marriage are between him and God and not available for outside discussion. There is a specific loneliness that belongs to this situation, and I do not think I have ever heard it described exactly right. It is not the loneliness of having no one around you. Amish life is communal in ways that the outside world has genuinely romanticized for good reason. There are people everywhere, all the time, sharing work and food and worship and the particular intimacy that comes from a community that has chosen to remain small on purpose. The loneliness is the loneliness of being completely surrounded and completely unseen simultaneously. Your mother sees the mark on your wrist and talks about the weather. Your neighbor hears the raised voice through the thin farmhouse wall and brings you a pie the next morning without mentioning it. Your sister meets your eyes across the table at Sunday dinner with a look that holds everything and says nothing because saying something would require her to step between a man and his God-given authority, and no one in that community has the framework to do that without feeling they are committing a sin of their own. I kept a tin box under the floorboard of the summer kitchen. I am telling you this because I think the tin box is the most honest thing I can show you about what surviving inside a situation like this actually looks like from the inside. It was not a plan. I did not have a plan for most of the time I was building what was inside it. I had an instinct, something below the level of language that understood my body and my survival even when my mind was still working very hard to make the marriage into something it was not going to become. Into the box went small amounts of money, egg money, a few dollars saved from the household accounts in margins too thin to be noticed, amounts that accumulated slowly enough that I did not have to think too clearly about what I was accumulating them for. By year 7, the box held enough that it had become impossible to pretend it was anything other than what it was. It was not a prayer. It was a door I was building in secret, one hinge at a time. The night I left, there was no single dramatic event that anyone would identify as a turning point if they were watching from outside. There was simply a moment where something in me stopped calculating whether staying or leaving was survivable and started calculating only one of those two options. I took the tin box. I took a single bag that I had packed and unpacked mentally so many times it took me less than 8 minutes to fill. I walked out of a house that I had cleaned and maintained and organized for 9 years, and I did not look back at it, not because I didn't grieve it, but because I understood that looking back was a luxury I could not afford in that moment. What came after leaving was not immediately better in the ways that outsiders sometimes imagine it must be. The outside world is not designed for a woman who has never had a bank account, never held a driver's license, never filled out a form for herself, never navigated a system that was not organized around the assumption that someone else was doing the navigating on her behalf. The practical difficulties were real, and they were daily. But underneath the practical difficulties was something that I did not have a name for at first and eventually understood was simply choice. The most ordinary choices, what to eat, what to wear, which direction to walk when I left a building, produced in me an emotional response that I was not prepared for, and that I have since learned is entirely common among women who come from where I came from. A therapist I began seeing in the first year after I left gave me a piece of language that reorganized everything I thought I understood about my marriage. She said that control almost never introduces itself honestly. It arrives wearing the vocabulary of care, of protection, of spiritual responsibility, of love. And the reason it is so effective is that the person inside it often cannot distinguish between the container and what has been poured into it. I sat with that for months. I am still sitting with it in some ways. I do not speak about my former community with hatred. I want to be clear about that, not as a disclaimer, but as the truth. The Amish world gave me things I have carried with me into every year of my life since leaving. A capacity for sustained work. A relationship to the natural world that I would not trade. A faith that I have rebuilt slowly and entirely on my own terms, into something that belongs to me in a way it never quite did when it was handed down as law. But the Amish world also permitted 9 years of a marriage in which my silence was called virtue, my fear was called respect. And the God who was supposed to be the ground of my entire existence was used consistently as the reason I was not allowed to ask for more than what I was given. There is no version of faith I have ever been able to access, inside that community or outside it, that requires a woman to be diminished in order for God to be honored. If what I have described today sounds familiar to you, if you recognize something in the architecture of control dressed as care, in the loneliness of being surrounded and unseen, in the hope that arrives after the harm and makes you stay, then I want you to know that what you experienced has a name, and the name is not marriage, and the name is not love. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. Tell me your story if you are ready to share it. There is no version of it too small or too complicated for this space. The full Amish Insider Guide is linked in the description if you want to go further. And if you want to keep hearing what life behind the prayer cap actually looks like from the women who lived it, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is so much I have not yet said. Until next time, the most sacred thing you possess is the life that belongs to you. Do not let anyone convince you that surrendering it is the same as offering it.